Significant territories of the USSR, spanning vast expanses of land, were subjected to a brutal occupation by German fascist forces and their allies from 1941 to 1943, a dark period lasting 2 years, and in some areas, an agonizing 3 years. The occupiers, driven by their ruthless ideology, unleashed a reign of terror on the Soviet populace, leaving an indelible mark on the very fabric of society. They established a draconian occupation regime, seeking to dominate every facet of the lives of the Soviet people, whom they derogatorily labeled as Untermenschen, a term that translates to inferior beings. This dehumanizing classification was a direct manifestation of the Nazi racial theory, which, coupled with their insidious propaganda, sanctioned the occupiers' abhorrent treatment of the inhabitants of the conquered Soviet territories. The German troops, in their relentless march across the Soviet Union, frequently halted in Soviet villages, often as transient forces en route to the front lines, or conversely, as columns of wounded soldiers retreating to the rear for medical attention. These unwelcome guests, with an air of entitlement, would typically overstay their presence for 2 to 3 days before continuing their journey. During their brief sojourns, they would commandeer domestic livestock, including poultry, piglets, cows, and sheep, and scavenge through the nooks and crannies of peasant dwellings and storage areas in search of eggs, salo, butter, and other provisions. However, as these raids became more frequent, the villagers found themselves with little left to offer, which only served to infuriate the occupiers. The Germans, in their arrogance, often attributed this scarcity to the perceived cunning of the Soviet people. If their pillaging yielded meager results, they might resort to physical violence, beating the villagers as a form of education or punishment. Tatiana Zuikova, a young resident of Ugra in the Smolensk region, bore witness to the cruelty of the occupation at the tender age of 15. Her first encounter with a German soldier occurred within the confines of her own home, a place that should have been a sanctuary. Tatiana, alone in the house, found herself face to face with a German soldier, his hands clutching an unknown object. In a moment of fear and confusion, the girl recoiled, colliding with the wall and collapsing onto a bag, her eyes wide with terror fixed upon the German invader. Sensing her fear, the soldier erupted into a raucous laughter, a sound that would haunt Tatiana's memories. When her mother returned, she found her daughter in a state of profound shock, struggling to process the trauma she had just endured. Some German detachments, due to various circumstances, found themselves stationed in villages and settlements for extended periods. Inevitably, they behaved as if they were the rightful owners of these lands. They appropriated the local bathhouses and barns for their personal use, forcing the villagers to vacate their homes and serve the occupiers, regardless of age. The Germans, in their delusional self-importance, considered themselves a beacon of culture, bringing enlightenment to what they perceived as uncivilized lands. They could feign kindness and peace, inviting the displaced homeowners to join them at their tables, offering them food, or presenting a child with a piece of bitter chocolate. They would pose for photographs with the children and women, their smiles belying the cruelty they were capable of. However, their attempts at humor often fell flat, bordering on the absurd. A Feldwebel stationed near Bryansk would offer Russian children German bonbons, but these treats were nothing more than pieces of dry fuel cunningly disguised in candy wrappers. One can only imagine the shock and dismay of a child biting into such a deceptive confection, while the Feldwebel, in a fit of maniacal laughter, reveled in the cruel joke. During Christmas, the Germans imposed their festive traditions on the conquered villages, forcing the residents to engage in merriment that was anything but joyful. They compelled the villagers to dance around a Christmas tree erected in a snowdrift in the courtyard, while a local musician, typically an elderly man, played the accordion or balalaika. The women and children, their hearts heavy with sorrow, were obliged to sing songs, circle the tree, and dance, all for the amusement of their oppressors. Rape, a heinous crime, was rampant in the occupied settlements, and underage girls were not spared from this brutality. The villagers, trapped in a living nightmare, had no avenue for recourse or justice. Another harrowing aspect of life under occupation was the periodic abduction of Soviet citizens, particularly the young, to be enslaved in Germany. The occupiers showed no mercy, and those who dared to resist or attempt escape faced the grim prospect of execution. After the war, a village elder, in a futile attempt to justify the heinous act of sending Soviet people to Germany as slaves, claimed, "If it wasn't me, someone else would have done it. We chose the strongest ones to endure the harsh labor." The Germans, amidst their campaign of terror, found time for revelry and debauchery. They indulged in drinking, singing, and dancing, often posing for photographs with their Untermenschen captives, weapons, and ammunition, as if celebrating their conquest. Mohian, an elderly villager who remained in his home with his grandchildren, recounted the horror of the German invasion. "They came, shouting demands for iron, hay, and wood. We had no choice but to give them everything we owned. They took our kerosene, devoured our food, slaughtered our chickens, and killed our cow. They forced us to labor for them, berating and shouting at us. We were made to pump water from the well all night, and when I sought a moment's rest, one of them struck me in the face, sending me sprawling into the snow. He yelled, 'Rusky, work, you swine!' Then they proceeded to loot the village, while my family and I were cast out into the bitter cold. We dug a hole in the snow and huddled there for several days until they finally departed." Hitler's words, penned in 1942, laid bare the Nazis' sinister agenda. The Germanization of the East consists in teaching the population the German language and German laws. "We want to achieve that in the East. Only people of German blood will live there." This statement, devoid of any pretense or remorse, revealed their intention to erase the very existence of the Soviet people. It is no wonder, then, that the fascists acted with such callousness and brutality on Soviet soil. They were mere instruments, devoid of humanity, carrying out the sinister plans of the Nazi regime. The newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, in its edition of December 10, 1941, painted a grim picture of the devastation wrought by the occupiers. The fires still smoldered, and the charred remains of houses stood alone along the road and in the gardens. The skeletons of destroyed enemy tanks, guns, and vehicles lay blackened and broken. In the village square, a crowd had gathered. The residents who had returned to their liberated village, freed from the German invaders just hours earlier. They gazed upon their once thriving village with sorrowful eyes. The recent plunder and destruction had left the once rich and flourishing village in ruins. Everywhere, the signs of the barbaric rampage were evident. For 2 interminable days, the occupiers held sway, their retreat marked by looting and destruction. They took whatever they could carry, their greed knowing no bounds. Anatoly, a young boy of 10, witnessed the Germans in his home, even tearing off the fur collar from his coat. They seized everything: Holstein cows, livestock, and food. What they couldn't carry, they destroyed, piercing items with bayonets, discarding them as trash, or using them for target practice, sometimes even using the corpses of domestic animals and, on occasion, humans, both adults and children. Vasily Klimov, aged 17, and his 15-year-old sister, in a desperate attempt to save a sheep from the fascist plunder, were spotted by a German soldier who opened fire. Vasily was killed, and his sister was wounded. The soldier's bullets were aimed not at the sheep, but at the innocent children. In a village in the Moscow region, the Germans perpetrated a massacre, executing all the men, mostly aged between 50 and 60, and subjecting every woman, including underage girls, to sexual violence. This horrific ordeal lasted nearly a day, leaving some women and girls traumatized to the point of mental breakdown. In a nearby village, the fascists tied 3 captured Red Army soldiers to a motorcycle, clad only in their underwear, and forced them to ride amidst the jeers and laughter of their captors until they collapsed from exhaustion. The soldiers were then callously executed. Such were the amusements of the occupiers, who reveled in the misery they inflicted. However, justice eventually caught up with many of these perpetrators. Numerous Nazis paid the ultimate price for their crimes, losing their lives, while others, captured and imprisoned, suffered the deterioration of their health in the harsh conditions of the polar tundra. Some managed to evade capture and punishment, but their lives were forever marked by fear and guilt, constantly looking over their shoulders, dreading the day when their past deeds would catch up with them.